Katherine of Aragon, remembered by history as the first wife of King Henry VIII, the wife he divorced, and the mother of the bloody Queen Mary. But who was Katherine prior to her marriage, and in her own right? Hello, my name is Hannah and I study royal history, and today we will be looking into the life of the Infanta Catalina of Aragon and Castile. If you're new here, I would really appreciate it if you subscribed. And into the video. Princess Katherine of Aragon was born Infanta Catalina on the 16th of December 1485 at the palace of the Bishop of Toledo at Alcalá de Henares. I have never taken a Spanish lesson in my life. I apologise for the pronunciation now. The youngest child of King Ferdinand II of Aragon and warrior Queen Isabella I of Castile. Their marriage was a dynamic and successful one. Her mother Isabella is quite remarkable for several reasons. Often regarded as the first Queen of Spain, as her marriage to Ferdinand united a divided Spain. Even more remarkable, Isabella gave birth to Catalina whilst at war, trying to complete their Christian Reconquista of Spain, or the Spanish Inquisition. And as such, the first 5 years of Catalina's life was spent following Ferdinand and Isabella's army. On the day that Catalina had been born, Isabella had been on horseback all day, gave birth, and was back in the saddle the next day. Catalina was left in the care of the nurses. A few days later, Catalina was baptized by the Bishop of Palencia. She was dressed in a christening gown of white brocade, lined with green velvet with a gold lace trim. Despite the brief bit of neglect that I've just described, Catalina's parents were as loving and attentive as was possible for monarchs of their time. Isabella cared deeply for all of her children and supervised their education, and there are records of Ferdinand buying dolls for his daughter. The children were kept close, and the loving relationship between Katherine and Isabella can be seen in Katherine's relationship with her own daughter Mary. It was noted that Katherine, out of all of her sisters, looked the most like her mother. As a toddler, Catalina had a pushcart to help her learn to walk, and she adored a drink known as rose honey and fruit jellies. Catalina's education had prepared her for queenship from the age of 2. Her father had been in talks with the King of England, King Henry VII, to arrange a marriage between his heir, Arthur, and Catalina. In March 1488, Ferdinand sent representatives to go see the 19-month-old Arthur Tudor to check for deformities. The English prince was dressed in gold, and Ferdinand and Isabella were impressed by what their representatives had reported of the young prince. However, the English king's reign was not secure, and they had concern about their daughter's safety. Their concerns would be confirmed with the rise of the pretender Perkin Warbeck in 1491. A year later, on the 14th of March 1489, the two kings signed the Treaty of Medina del Campo, which agreed that the Infanta Catalina would bring 200,000 crowns as her dowry. I think that's roughly about 5 mil today. And it was agreed that Catalina would go to England at the age of 14. This treaty was advantageous for both sides. England would get a boost on the world stage of politics, and Spain got an ally for a war against France. 1490 saw Catalina's eldest sister, Isabella, wed Alfonso of Portugal. The marriage was arranged, but the two were able to find love. Unfortunately, it would not last long, as Alfonso fell off his horse 7 months later on the 13th of July 1491 and died. June 1491, Granada, the last state to resist a united Spain, finally surrendered. A ceremony was staged to celebrate the occasion, to which Catalina and her siblings witnessed. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand continued to tour their kingdom, asserting their royal authority before taking up residence in Granada. After the fall of Granada, the Pope had awarded Ferdinand and Isabella the title of the Catholic Kings. After the death of Alfonso, Infanta Isabella returned to Spain, expecting to live out her life as a nun, But Ferdinand has her remarried to Alfonso's cousin, King Manuel I of Portugal, in 1497. The four infantas, Isabella, Juana, Maria and Catalina, were sent to the Palace of Alhambra in 1492, where they grew to maturity and were educated. Life at Alhambra was idyllic, and they rarely left their home, except for state occasions. Alhambra, which is situated in Granada, was the most spectacular of Spanish palaces, a paradise of marble courtyards and painted ceilings, crystal pools, and fountains. Ferdinand negotiated with King Henry VII that Catalina would go to England in 1498 when she was 12. On the 20th of January 1495, marriages were agreed for Catalina's siblings, John, or Juan, and Joanna, Juana. It was agreed that Juan would marry Margaret of Austria and Juana would marry Philip the Handsome in 1497 and in 1496 respectively. Margaret and Philip were also siblings and children of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. Juana and Philip's wedding day arrived on the 20th of October 1496. They were wed in Leer. I think it's fair to say that Juana was a bit obsessed with her new husband, and she would fly into rages when he took mistresses. Her behaviour became troubling for her mother, who ultimately was powerless to do anything, and presumably it troubled her siblings too. On the 18th of March 1497 in northern Castile, Margaret, or Marguerite of Austria, was presented to the Spanish court. The boat that had dropped Juana off to Flanders transported Margaret to Spain in the sibling exchange. Catalina and her sisters Isabella and Maria were in attendance of Margaret's presentation. Catalina was wearing a gown of brocaded cloth of gold together with a crimson scarf and a black mantilla. Prince Juan and Margaret were wed at Burgos Cathedral in Castile on the 3rd of April 1497. Juan would die 6 months later on the 4th of October. The young couple were aged about 17 and were so infatuated with each other that Juan's doctors warned him to restrain his physical passions. His sudden premature death, after only 6 months of marriage, was diagnosed as overexertion in the marital bed. But Margaret wasn't alone, as she was pregnant with Juan's child. King Henry VII sent Catalina a blessed ring as a token of his fatherly affection, and later in the August, Catalina and Prince Arthur were formally betrothed at the ancient palace of Woodstock in Oxfordshire. In the December, Catalina's new mother-in-law, Queen Elizabeth of York, wrote to Queen Isabella asking to be kept informed of the health of her future daughter-in-law, whom we think of and esteem as our own daughter. Queen Elizabeth of York and Lady Margaret Beaufort asked Isabella and Ferdinand to ensure that Catalina practiced speaking French with Margaret of Austria, as this was the diplomatic language of Europe at the time, and neither Elizabeth or Margaret understood Latin or Spanish. They also recommended that Catalina get used to drinking wine over water, as you couldn't guarantee you wouldn't catch something from the English water. On the 2nd of April 1498, Catalina's sister-in-law Margaret of Austria gave birth to a stillborn, although some sources say miscarried a male fetus, so With no child and heir, Margaret returned to her father. I can imagine that Catalina would have been sad at this news of Margaret having to leave, as the two had struck up a friendship. Catalina would be faced with further sadness on the 23rd of August 1498, when her sister Isabella, Queen of Portugal, died from childbirth complications. Her son, named Miguel, survived, but he would join his mother 2 years later. Isabella's husband, Manuel I, would remarry, but not to who you expect. Isabella's husband, Manuel I, would remarry to Isabella and Catalina's sister, Maria. 1498 was also the year that Catalina was supposed to go to England. However, her arrival was pushed back again until September 1500, as Prince Arthur would then be 14 and capable of consummating the marriage. Ferdinand and Isabella were still concerned about Perkin Warbeck and the existence of the Earl of Warwick and the threat that they posed to their daughter. I don't know what happened next, but Henry must have been able to soothe the Spanish monarch's fears, as the proxy wedding for their children took place on the 19th of May, 1499, at Prince Arthur's manor house at Bewdley near Worcester. By the summer of 1499, Catalina was the only child left at Alhambra, as her other siblings had either travelled, like Juana and Maria, or had died, like Juan and Isabella. Prince Arthur wrote several times to his bride, of which only one letter survives, dated October 1499 and written in Latin to "My dearest spouse." In it, he acknowledges the sweet letters sent to him by her, which so delighted him that he fancied he conversed with her and embraced her. Oh, they're so cute! Ferdinand, however, wasn't as keen as the young prince seemed. He made it clear to King Henry VII that Catalina would not go to England all the time that the Earl of Warwick and Perkin Warbeck were alive. Also, what with the deaths of her two children, Isabella and Juan, Queen Isabella was reluctant to let her precious remaining unmarried daughter, Catalina, leave her. Isabella grieved deeply for her children and was now determined to secure a happy and safe match. Henry wanted to keep his powerful friend and sentenced the two men to death. They were beheaded in November 1499. In April 1501, Queen Isabella announced that her daughter Catalina was ready to go to England, and another proxy wedding took place at Bewdley on the 19th of May 1501. 2 years to the day since the previous proxy wedding took place. This second one was to make sure that nothing was found lacking from the first. Catalina left Alhambra for the final time on the 21st of May 1501 and headed to the port of Corunna, where she would take a ship to England. She arrived at Corunna on the 20th of July 1501, but Catalina did not set sail until the 17th of August due to high winds. The sea crossing was terrible. A violent storm blew up in the Bay of Biscay. Catalina was very seasick and later wrote to her mother to say it was impossible not to be terrified of the storm. The captain was forced to return to Spain. They tried again on the 27th of September 1501, when the winds had died down enough, and this time she did set sail for England. Catalina arrived in England at Plymouth on the 2nd of October 1501, where she was met with cheering and waving, and there were banners in the street. It was noted that Catalina, who will now be known as Catherine, could not have been received with greater joy if she had been the saviour of the world. While at Plymouth, Catherine ate and gave thanks, and a royal messenger was sent to inform the king of his daughter-in-law's arrival. Prince Arthur arrived at Bishop's Palace at Doxsmerfield on the 4th of November 1501 with his father and the lords of the Privy Council. The King of England declared to see his daughter-in-law, but Count de Cabra and Donna Elvira informed him that Catherine was sleeping and was not receiving visitors. The king was fuming. He feared that the princess was ugly or that something was wrong with her. He argued with Cabra and Elvira, and in the end he was allowed into Catherine's chamber and was relieved that she was as pretty as he had been told. Catherine and Arthur conversed through an interpreter, and he later told his parents that he had never felt so much joy in his life as when he beheld the sweet face of his bride. Later that evening, Catherine entertained the king and his son in her chamber with music and dancing. In the morning, Henry and Arthur took their leave to prepare for the wedding, due to take place in 10 days' time. On the 9th of November 1501, Catherine arrived at Deptford. She was welcomed by Edward Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, and Henry, Duke of York. They then conducted her to her lodgings in Lambeth Palace. Catherine made her state entry into London on the 12th of November 1501. Sir Thomas More, who was in the crowd of people hoping to catch a glimpse at her, wrote, "She thrilled the hearts of everyone. There is nothing wanting in her that the most beautiful girls should have. Everyone is singing her praises." Catherine had a wide gown on with a gathered skirt over a farthingale with bell-shaped sleeves. This style of dress was uncommon to the English, and the hooped skirt was not very flattering. As Catherine was short, and the skirt, well, it made her look as wide as she was tall. King Henry and Queen Elizabeth, who were wearing crowns and velvet robes trimmed with ermine, watched the procession from a window in Cheapside with their son, Prince Arthur. Catherine then rode back to Lambeth Palace, and the same eager crowds appeared 2 days later for the wedding. Catherine and Arthur were wed in St. Paul's Cathedral on the 14th of November 1501. Henry, Duke of York, had the honour of giving Catherine away. Catherine wore a white satin Spanish-style dress with bell sleeves and a fully pleated skirt over a farthingale. On her head she had a huge white silk coif, edged with a border of gold, pearls, and precious stones. Her ladies following behind wore similar attire. At the wedding banquet, Catherine, now Princess of Wales, danced in a very regal manner, clicking castanets, while Henry, Duke of York, not so regally, whipped off his gown and whirled his sister Margaret across the floor, leaping and twirling to the music. The Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of London blessed the bed, and the newlywed couple were left alone behind closed curtains. Whether they did or not is a matter for another day. The next day Arthur was boasting about how he had been in Spain and that marriage was thirsty work. But I think that's more of a 15-year-old's ego talking. Arthur wrote to his Spanish in-laws Ferdinand and Isabella, telling them how happy he was and assuring them he would be a true and loving husband all of his days. Catherine would begin a lifelong friendship with Margaret Plantagenet. Margaret was the first cousin of Elizabeth of York and around 15 years older than Catherine. Margaret and her husband, Sir Richard Pole, were part of Arthur's entourage, and this is how the two women most likely met. On the 21st of December 1501, Catherine and Arthur left Baynard's Castle for Ludlow. Catherine was used to the warmer climate of Spain and travelled by litter, wrapped in furs while everyone else rode on horseback. Arthur's health had been iffy prior to leaving, and the cold, bitter winds would not have improved his health either, and they arrived at Ludlow in the January of 1502. The Prince and Princess of Wales caught a virus during March of 1502. Catherine made a full recovery, but for Arthur, this would be the beginning of the end. Arthur would fall victim to the disease on the 2nd of April 1502. It is thought that he died of the sweating sickness. Catherine had been raised for queenship since she was 2 years old, and now it looked like it was all in vain. For now, Catherine's future was unknown. Arthur's death left her alone in a foreign country, and she sunk into depression. Catherine travelled to Richmond Palace, where she was greeted by her mother-in-law. The two women found comfort in their shared sorrow, and Queen Elizabeth would act as a mother figure to Catherine for the short time that she had left. Both Henry and Ferdinand were desperate to find out if Catherine was carrying an heir, but the men had varying tactics. Ferdinand tried to find out discreetly by asking courtiers, while Henry asked her outright. Catherine claimed she was still a virgin. The death of Arthur caused Ferdinand and Henry to argue about Catherine's dowry, as it had only been partially paid. Ferdinand then pushed for a new marriage arrangement between Catherine and Henry, Duke of York. This match would allow King Henry VII to keep Catherine's dowry, and the final payment would be made once the marriage had been consummated. It was rumoured that King Louis XII was trying to block the betrothal, as he wanted to set up a French marriage for the Duke of York. King Henry VII and Catherine's parents agreed on the match, and King Henry VII wrote to Isabella, recounting his conversation with Catherine. Isabella wrote back announcing that she was satisfied that our daughter remains as she were here, a virgin. Life after Arthur's death was pretty dull. It was not seen fit for a widow to dance in public or take part in court entertainment, so she spent her life with religion, needlework, and a quiet sociability in the Queen's apartments. Not exactly the life a 16-year-old dreams of, and thus the idea of marrying the 11-year-old Duke of York was rather appealing, as it would end the misery. In February 1503, Catherine's mother-in-law, Queen Elizabeth of York, went into labour, and neither mother or child survived. After Henry had somewhat recovered from his depression over the death of his wife, he was still arguing with Catherine's father Ferdinand over her dowry, and he began negotiations for him to marry Catherine himself, so he could keep her dowry. Catherine's mother Isabella was horrified and blocked the match, commenting that a marriage between King Henry VII and Catherine was a thing not to be endured. Isabella suggested widowed Joan of Naples as an alternative bride, but nothing came of this. Not wanting to lose Catherine or her dowry, he abandoned his plan on marrying Catherine herself and proceeded with the marriage treaty for his son Henry to Catherine. The marriage treaty was signed on the 23rd of June, 1503, and the couple were formally betrothed 2 days later. The marriage was set to take place in 1505, when the Duke of York was 14. Ferdinand and Isabella requested a dispensation for the match from the Pope, similarly to what happened with King Manuel and Catherine's sisters Isabella and Maria. The Pope, Julius II, issued the Bull of Dispensation on the 26th of December 1503, in spite of the fact she may have consummated her first marriage by carnal knowledge. Henry, Duke of York, was invested as Prince of Wales on the 18th of February 1504. Catherine was enjoying her freedom at the English court, dancing, smiling, and kissing courtiers on the lips when they arrived. Her governess, Donna Elvira, was less than impressed and wrote to her father about her outrageous behaviour. Ferdinand replied that Catherine must behave as was fitting for her honour and dignity, and Henry VII said the princess must obey her father's orders. In 1504, Catherine fell very ill. She was very pale and had a fever and was unable to eat. It is thought that this was down to her not being able to adapt to the English climate. I was born here and I still haven't adapted. It was feared that Catherine may die, and Prince Henry wrote to her parents. Queen Isabella was also ill, but Catherine was unaware of her mother's illness, and while Catherine improved, Isabella declined. On her deathbed, she voiced her inner doubts about the validity of the Pope's dispensation, but she was largely ignored. Queen Isabella of Castile died on the 26th of November 1504, and her death had a catastrophic effect for Catherine. Her father, Ferdinand, was not her heir, so the Kingdom of Castile went to Catherine's sister, Juana. News of Isabella's death didn't reach England until December. Catherine was now the daughter of tiny Aragon and not the mighty Spain. So Henry VII was considering other brides for his son, and in the meantime stopped Catherine's allowance as he hadn't received her full dowry. By the February of the next year, Catherine could not afford to pay her servants. Ferdinand refused to support her financially as he viewed it as Henry's responsibility. Henry fed her, but he saw it as Ferdinand's responsibility. Catherine's gowns were becoming shabby, and she couldn't afford to get them fixed. Henry, Prince of Wales's 14th birthday came and went, and no wedding had occurred. Prior to the prince's birthday, King Henry VII had marched his son before the Bishop of Winchester and made the boy revoke the promises made at his betrothal on the grounds that they were made when he was a minor and incapable under the law of deciding such things. This secret meeting was to ensure that if a better match presented itself, then there would be no difficulty in breaking his pre-contract to Catherine. In the October, Henry entered secret negotiations with Catherine's sister Juana for a marriage between the Prince of Wales and Juana's 6-year-old daughter, Eleanor. Eleanor was a much better match than Catherine, as her mother was Queen of Castile in her own right, and her father was heir to the Habsburg territories, and might one day be Holy Roman Emperor. Catherine had no idea why King Henry was treating her so coldly in the December. She asked her father to make a substitute payment of gold for the jewels and plate in her possession. He agreed, but by April 1506, King Henry VII was complaining bitterly about the delay, as Catherine had led him to expect a second payment. This wasn't Ferdinand being difficult. Under the terms of the marriage agreement, he didn't technically have to pay until the couple had consummated their marriage. In January 1506, Juana and her husband Philip got shipwrecked off the coast of England, and King Henry welcomed them at Windsor Castle. The men saw this as an opportunity to continue marriage talks between Henry and Eleanor. Catherine hadn't seen her sister since Juana had left Spain to get married, and she was looking forward to reconnecting with her sister, and had hopes that Juana may be able to improve her situation. But Juana's mental health wasn't great. Juana was depressed and was only interested in her husband and her problems, not Catherine, and it became apparent that, after a decade apart, they had grown apart. While Juana and Philip were in England, King Henry put on great theatrics, making Catherine a prominent part of the festivities. He gave her new dresses, and she was sat next to her sister-in-law, Mary. This was a far cry than what Catherine had been experiencing, but it painted a picture that Catherine was well looked after. However, Catherine was always under Henry VII's watchful eye, and was only allowed 30 minutes alone with her sister. He was cautious about letting her spend too much time with Juana, in case she voiced her complaints about Henry's treatment of her. Not that he had to worry, the girls had very little in common anymore, and so Catherine didn't even attempt to ask her sister for help, sensing it would be futile. Philip and Juana left England in the April, and the two sisters would never see each other again. Catherine's financial situation had become so dire that she had to sell her dowry plate and jewels to try and maintain her appearance and household. By the late summer, King Henry VII allowed Catherine and her fiancé, Henry, to spend time together. The two became close, and the Prince of Wales never hinted at his secret rejection, and he referred to her as my most dear and well-beloved consort, the princess of my wife. Now, I'm not sure what Henry VII was expecting when he puts two teenagers together, but he didn't like that they were getting close, so he sent Catherine away to Fulham Palace. In March 1507, King Henry VII was tired of waiting for Ferdinand to cough up the dowry, so he gave him 6 months to pay up, and he warned him, "Many other princesses have been offered in marriage to the Prince of Wales, with greater marriage portions." In April 1507, Ferdinand wrote to Catherine asking for her opinion for the next Spanish ambassador, and in her response, she warned her father about what might be reported about her shabby attire and her servants wearing rags. Ferdinand had been unaware of his daughter's situation, although I do wonder how, since he refused to financially support her, but he was impressed with how Catherine had handled the situation, as it could have been a political upset, and so she was appointed as the Spanish ambassador on the 19th of May until her father could find a more suitable replacement, and she became the first female Spanish ambassador in England. Women had never acted in such capacity before. Her new role enhanced her status at court. She learnt court politics and was very good at the job. After bouts of illness due to stress, being ambassador allowed her to regain some of her natural colour. During this time at the English court, the royal family were very pro-Spain and anti-French, and as a result, the idea of Henry marrying Catherine became more appealing. and as such she was present at the tournaments held for the prince's 16th birthday, although this did nothing to bring the wedding any closer. She wrote to her father in the July and said, "Nothing has changed," which understandably was causing her distress. King Henry's wife, as we know, died in 1503, and since January 1507 he had been pursuing Catherine's sister, Juana, as his new bride, as Philip died not long after they returned from England. Henry spoke to Catherine and discussed his intentions to marry Juana. As he had already met her, he knew what she looked like, and her mental illness didn't bother him, as she was only going to be a consort. Catherine supported the match in hopes that it would mean her and Prince Henry's marriage would materialise. But when she wrote to her father, he told her to tell the King of England that it was not yet known whether Queen Juana will be inclined to marry again, although it was certain that if she became so inclined, it shall be no other person than the King of England. In the September, Catherine took advantage of her situation and Ferdinand sent her 2,000 ducats so she could clear her debts, buy new clothes, and pay her servants. King Henry, not wanting to be outdone by Ferdinand, and also wanting to impress him so he could wed Juana, started paying Catherine an allowance. Ferdinand would lead Henry on with the prospect of marrying Juana until 1508. Unsurprisingly, their relations worsened in March 1508 when Henry was informed that Juana was too ill to marry and he realised that marriage would not be happening. He dropped his interest in Juana and in Catherine. Catherine's replacement as the Spanish ambassador arrived in the spring, and with it, her power and respect at court evaporated. In January 1509, King Henry VII's illness became apparent, and he was unable to find a better match for Prince Henry. So, he was considering the idea of Catherine, as he feared for the succession. King Henry had stopped Catherine's allowance once the marriage with Juana was off the table. She sold all of her household goods to make ends meet. She wrote to her father in early 1509, telling him of her suffering, her depression, and how she felt she could not endure much more, as she might do something that neither the King of England nor your Highness would be able to prevent. Heartbroken that his daughter felt that life wasn't worth living, Ferdinand finally made the dowry payment that King Henry had been after for years. But when his ambassador, Don Luis Carlos, went to find the English king to inform him, the king was too ill. King Henry admitted on his deathbed that he thought he might have treated Catherine too harshly, and that he wanted his son, Henry, to make amends and do the honourable thing and marry her. King Henry VII died on the 21st of April 1509, and his son, Prince Henry, became King Henry VIII. The new King of England was hesitant at marrying Catherine, as she was his brother's widow, a big no-no, and something that would come to haunt him 2 decades later. But Ferdinand reassured Henry that the Pope had given a dispensation. The marriage would bring an alliance between England and Spain. Ferdinand told Catherine he loved her, the most of his children, and looks on the King of England like a son. Ferdinand also explained how 2 of Catherine's sisters had married the same King of Portugal, and that was fine. The Privy Council also urged the new king to marry Catherine and fulfill the treaty. The king agreed. There were many good reasons for the marriage, but above all, he told them he desired her above all women. He loved her and longed to wed her. So on one day in early June, King Henry VIII went to Catherine's apartments, dismissed her attendants, and declared his love for her. When he asked her to be his wife, she happily agreed. I can imagine her sitting there like, "Finally, you took long enough." Catherine and Henry were wed in a private ceremony on the 11th of June 1509. Catherine wore virginal white, just to highlight the fact she was still a virgin and had not consummated her marriage to Arthur. Her hair was down, she wore a gold circlet, and vowed to be bon air and bosom in bed and at board. The new king and queen then had a joint coronation at Westminster Abbey on the 24th of June 1509, where Catherine once again wore white. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this video with a friend. The next video will be on Catherine's life as Queen of England. I think I might do it in 2 parts, as this one is a very long video and is gonna be painful to edit. But until the next one, have a wonderful day.